What caused the financial crisis? The financial crisis, in my opinion, was caused by two things. The unwavering belief that the housing market would continue upward forever, and the shady dealings of the banks lending out mortgages to the people who wanted to invest in these homes. In 2007, the housing market was doing better than ever. It was seen as a good investment to buy a house by the American people, since the prices were just continuing upward and there was no decline whatsoever. This, of course, created a bubble in the economy of the housing markets, which could have been manageable if it weren't for the shady dealings of the banks. You see, when the American people wanted to buy a house, they couldn't just give cash at hand because that's way too expensive. No, they took a loan from the bank, promising that they would pay them back in maybe the next 30 years, and if they didn't, they could take the house, or take their car, or take whatever they wanted to pay off the mortgage. But the banks didn't just keep the loan and the promise that you would pay them back. No, they sold them off to investment firms. So they sold off your promise that you would pay them back over the next 30 years to new dealers who said, we'll take the risk off your hands if you give us the money from these investments, and we'll give you money straight away. But the investment firms didn't want this risk either. They want to spread out the risk and make it less risky for themselves. The way they did this was by combining maybe 1,000 American people's promises that they would pay back their mortgage and putting it in a bundle. They would then sell off these bundles and diversify the risk, make it less risky for every person by having a lot of people come together and share the risk and the negative effects if they were to occur. There was a rating system who was in charge of rating every one of these packages and saying this one has a really big chance of being paid back solidly for the next 30 years, and this one has a really low chance because it's filled with people who may not have a job or may not have very good credit. This would be analogous with a teacher who was being paid not by the school but by the very students that he's giving grades to. This would of course bias the rating system and create some very corrupt dealings in the process. What they were doing was essentially taking all the poor people, all the people with bad chance of paying off their mortgage, and sprinkling in some trustworthy and really rich people who had a big chance of paying off their mortgage, and combining them to get a really high score for some really bad and risky investments. So when the bubble burst, which was at any rate inevitable, it wasn't just the people who had invested or had mortgages and who bought the houses who were getting screwed. It was also the very high up people who thought that all their investments were solid and low risk. This essentially created a giant misplacement of money. This forced a lot of regular American people out of their homes and out of their houses. They had to default on everything they had, and this essentially threw them out on the street with no money. But it weren't just the regular people who were getting screwed. Everyone who had believed in the rating system, who had thought that AAA ratings were solid and couldn't be lost, were essentially screwed. All the money that they had invested was suddenly gone in a split second, and no one knew what to do. Everyone, of course, pulled out of the market as soon as they heard of the news, which created a huge fall in the housing market. The American people were out on their asses before they knew what had happened. But it wasn't just them. The investment firms couldn't pay back their investors, and some of them even went bankrupt before the government bailed them out. So this is essentially how the financial crisis of 2008 occurred.